Ever since I was a little kid, I've always been kind of curious to see how things work. It's one of those things that kind of defined me as a child. I was always curious to know how like fans worked or what my grandma was cooking, how she was doing it, what made the things that she made so special. I remember one time there was a fan in my room and I was so fascinated by how it worked that I took it apart and I wanted to know all of the like inner workings of this fan. I couldn't really quite put it back together properly, but I was curious to see how the insides looked. And then later, I was very curious about planes, and so I really wanted to know how these like seemingly straight wings could lift a plane off of the ground and take hundreds of people with their luggages from one place to the other. And so I was so curious to see how this all worked. And then I learned about the shape of the wing and how wind um, kind of flows over the wing and like creates lift and all of these things, right? It's just like this curiosity that just kind of was always a part of me. It's a part of me because I want to make sense of the world. That's one of the things that as humans we try really hard at, right? We try to make sense of the things that surround us. We want to know why things are the way that they are, why things are happening in the way that they're happening. It's a defining feature of humanity. And it's quite natural for us to want to have a sense of these things. For me personally, it's a sense of control. I want to be in control of what's happening. Knowing what is happening, making sense of all of these things, allows me to have a better sense of control. I know what's coming. I know what to expect. I know what not to expect. It's this making sense of our world that is crucial to me. We're beginning a new series on the book of Job this week. And Job is kind of dealing with these questions about making sense with his experience. The book of Job is to be honest, quite complicated. There's a lot of things happening in this story. But the focus of our series for the next couple of weeks will be just that. It will be try to understand where Job is coming from as he tries to make sense of his experience. If you've never read the book of Job before, this will be a great time for you to read through it. We won't be doing it as closely verse by verse as we did with the book of Romans, the series that we just concluded. But rather, we're going to be approaching Job with more thematic. We're going to be looking at some of the themes in Job and trying to draw some of the principles that we can gather from Job. As I said, Job is quite complicated, and it's, to be honest, it's been used in various ways. Ways that I think aren't always fair to the story, and ways that I think are maybe true to the story. But our time together with Job is going to be spent, I think, kind of looking at an outline of a sketch of the relationship between this man Job and God. That is kind of the purpose of Job. Looking at that relationship of righteousness and faith, and what is our experience with God. I say that because oftentimes the book of Job is understood to be one that produces a theodicy. I'm not saying the Odyssey, I'm saying theodicy. You'll see it on your screen here pretty soon. A theodicy is simply an explanation, an apology in the classical sense, or an argument for the goodness of God in light of all of the evil that we have in the world. That sort of line of thinking, those sort of thoughts, those sort of arguments, the books that are written in this realm are called theodicies. It's justification for God's goodness in light of all of the evil in the world. And many take Job to be a prime example in the Bible of a theodicy. But I want to push back and say that if that's how you approach Job, then to hold that and kind of set it aside for a moment as we spend a few weeks with the story of Job here. Because just like I did with Romans, and I said at the very beginning that the thrust that I wanted to get from Romans was the unity that Paul was seeking in this community. For Job, it's going to be this relationship between man and God, trying to get a sense of where righteousness fits into all of that. Because right off the bat, I have to mention one thing that's crucial to understanding the book of Job. And unfortunately, we're not going to have an in-depth study of this, but you have to know Proverbs pretty well to understand the book of Job. Because in the Bible, these two books kind of play a tension within one another within the Bible. There's this tension between them, or you could maybe describe it better as a balance between Job and Proverbs. Because you almost see like a competing understanding of our place in the universe in these two books. Job is a book of wisdom, just like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. But unlike Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Job can both be characterized as protest wisdom. They're kind of protesting the status quo. They're kind of protesting what they're being confronted with. If you know Ecclesiastes, you know that this will be the case for Ecclesiastes. And Job is no different. Job is providing a protest here. Oftentimes we read Job, and the theme that we want to pull out of Job, the practice that we want to pull out of Job is one where we kind of want to produce a guide to suffering through the book of Job. And I think this is an unhelpful way to look at the book of Job. So if that's another perspective that you carry as you read the book of Job, I'm going to ask you once again to hold that aside as we read the book of Job together. Because it's not a guide for suffering. Oftentimes, many people want to hold Job in this place in a virtuous place, on this elevated stool, because of his the way that he suffered through all of these things. But again, I want you to set that aside, because what Job is doing here is much more profound. It's deeper, and it's getting at the heart of human experience. That's what I want us to get to. I want us to get to the heart of Job's experience at this place. This is the way that I read the Bible. This is the way that I approach many of these texts. You'll know that this is my method. If you're joining our Wednesday night Bible study, you'll know that I want us to put ourselves in the shoes the best we can of many of these characters. And Job here is going to be no different. Because Job's life here, his response in this text is going to be one that has highs and lows. There's peaks and valleys to Job's response here. We do a great disservice to the book of Job if we kind of glaze over it and say Job was a righteous man because he suffered without questioning God. And that is just a narrative that simply is not true, and it's a narrative that will simply not hold up if we look at this story closely. The reason why many scholars look at the book of Job as a book of protest is precisely because Job gets or becomes fed up with his situation, fed up with the senseless suffering and evil that falls upon him. And it's that word senseless evil that we have to grapple with. I'm sure there's many of you who have seen loved ones suffer. It's to the point where you feel that you want to do everything in your power to relieve that person's suffering. But you're powerless. There's nothing that you can do, right? I want us to hold that perspective as we approach the book of Job. And so for today, I just want us to do a brief outline of the story I just want us to look at the prologue and see what the context, what the story is setting in motion for us this morning. So if you open your Bibles with me to the book of Job, we're going to start in chapter 1. This is probably this week, and the final week is probably the only time where we'll be reading very closely in the book of Job. And so I'll be depending on you to kind of read along at home, in your spare time, in your morning devotionals, evening devotionals, whatever it is for you, that you read along on your own time. That way, when we come to Sabbath every morning, I will give the highlights of many of the story, but we won't have time to get into all of the details. Because once again, Job is quite a lengthy book. It's a little bit repetitive, and so we wouldn't want to do a verse-by-verse study like we typically would. But again, we're going to follow this morning where the context, the setting, the author is setting in place this story. It's moving forward by first setting the stage for this man, Job. And so if you look at Job chapter 1, you'll see that there was once a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. And it goes on to describe Job as a blameless man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. Now this man, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He had many servants, and he was in fact the richest person in that entire area. Job's sons would take turns preparing feasts in their homes, and they would also invite their 3 sisters to celebrate with them. When these celebrations ended, sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, "Perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. And so right off the bat, we see that Job is an extremely righteous man. He's a man of high integrity. And right off the bat here, we see that Job is setting up, the book of Job is setting up this character, the character Job, as this righteous and person with high integrity for a very specific reason. The book of Proverbs is often one who throughout the book, you'll see mention of ideas that if a person is righteous, if a person is upright, if they do the right things before God, God will bless them immensely. It's a book of the Bible that the prosperity gospel folks love a lot because there's a lot of things in that book that provide background for these ideas. But many think that Job is a book of protest because it's protesting that idea that righteousness before God produces a good life. For Job, that's sort of a misrepresentation of what life is. And unfortunately, we've created this kind of space in Christianity that kind of produces these ideas quite frequently in church. That if we act in the right way, if we do the right things, if we go to church, if we pray constantly, if we have our devotionals, X, Y, and Z, if we're pious folks, then God will inevitably take care of us. That things will not befall us. Of course, that's not the only message of Proverbs. Of course, Proverbs also has text in it where it shows that this simply is not true. But the overarching theme of Proverbs is one where that if we place this order into existence, then we can expect a certain outcome. And you'll see these ideas portrayed in Job's friends, who we'll introduce in a little bit. Verse 6. One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. "Where have you come from?" the Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, "I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on." Then the Lord asked Satan, "Have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil." Satan replies to the Lord, "Yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him in his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Satan says, of course he's a righteous man. Of course he's a good person. Of course he fears God. Meaning respect in this instance, of course. Of course, all of these things. Look at him. He's happy. He's blessed. He has everything that he could ever want. And so God responds. He says, "All right, you may test him," the Lord said to Satan. "Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically." So Satan left the Lord's presence. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting at the oldest brother's house, a messenger arrived at Job's home with this news. So the sons and daughters, they were gathered together feasting one day, and Job was probably in his own place, his own house. And a messenger comes to him with this news. He says, "Your oxen were plowing with the donkeys, feeding beside them, when the Sabians raided us. They stole all the animals and killed all the farmhands. I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. "The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, a third messenger arrived with this news. "3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants. I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. "Your sons and daughters were feasting in their oldest brother's home. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed, and all your children are dead. I am the only one who escaped to tell you." Job stood up and tore his robe in grief, and then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, "I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord." In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. So here, Job has lost all of his possessions. He's lost his children. He's lost the animals that he's had. His servants, many have been slain or taken away. And here, chapter 1, Job's first trial here leaves him saying, in all of this, he praises the name of the Lord, and he does not sin by blaming God. So his first trial, and Job walks away from it, heartbroken, of course, devastated, of course, but he doesn't sin by blaming God. He maintains his integrity. He maintains his place of quote, righteousness before God. And so we move on to chapter 2, the second trial, the second test that Job faces. One day, the members of the heavenly court, they came again to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser Satan came with them. Once again, the Lord asked him, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on." And then the Lord asked Satan, "Have you noticed my servant Job?" It's like, God, why do you keep bringing up Job? The poor guy's already gone through enough. He says, "He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil, and he has maintained his integrity, even though you urged me to harm him without cause." Satan replied to the Lord, "Skin for skin. A man will give up everything he has to save his life, but reach out and take away his health, and he will surely curse you to your face." In other words, what Satan is accusing Job of is almost ulterior motives here. He's saying, of course he's going to obey you. Of course he's going to be righteous, and of course he's going to live a life of integrity. At first, because he had all of these things. Of course, now that he doesn't have these things, now he's doing it for his own skin. He wants to save himself. At the end of the day, we're still going to try and save ourselves. And so God says in verse 6, "All right, do with him as you please," the Lord said to Satan, "but spare his life." So Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to feet. Job scraped his skin with a broken piece of pottery as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job replied, "You talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad?" So in all this, Job said nothing wrong. When 3 of Job's friends heard of the tragedy he had suffered, they got together and traveled from their homes to comfort and console him. Their names were Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. When they saw Job from a distance, they scarcely recognized him. Wailing loudly, they tore their robes and threw dust into the air over their heads to show their grief. When they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights, no one said a word to Job, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. Once again, I want us to realize here how the book is being set up. I mentioned at the beginning that this book is set up as a protest wisdom. That the book is protest wisdom. That in some ways it's protesting what is taught in Proverbs. Once again, Proverbs often espousing the doctrine of retribution. That God always rewards the righteous and God punishes the wicked. There's a number of Proverbs that kind of highlight these things for us. For example, Proverbs 16:7 says, "When the ways of people please the Lord, he causes even their enemies to be at peace with him." Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, it kind of indicates this kind of same thing, that if you trust in God, you will get long life, prosperity, and the favor of God and others. You can also see this in chapters 9, verses 10 through 12. But the problem with Proverbs, and like any Proverbs, including biblical Proverbs, is that they're not meant to be universal truisms. They're not meant to be universal promises. They are kind of partial perspectives that kind of accurately portray or reflect parts of the truth. You can say out of sight, out of mind, right? That's a proverb that we say in our English language. Yet at the same time, we have the proverb that absence makes the heart grow fonder. We have many hands make light work, yet too many cooks spoil the broth. Look before you leap, yet he who hesitates is lost. Each of these proverbs is true, but they are not the whole truth. They're not the complete truth of reality. Thus, biblical proverbs, in much the same way, reflect that sort of partial truth, partial truisms that are true for some examples, for some instances, and not always universal. Yet some people, probably in Job's time and in our time as well, want to use these proverbs as almost universal maxims for all these things. And Job's friends are kind of the examples set up that use these flexible proverbs into rigid laws. And this is where Job, the book of Job, is kind of pushing against this idea, pushing against this notion that we can make proverbs, good biblical proverbs, these truisms that reflect parts of the truth of our world, into rigid laws. The idea that God only rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked will of course be pushed. It's an idea that Job will of course push against it, because just how it was set up in the beginning of Job, Job is set up as this righteous person with high integrity. This is the meaning of that introduction. They're setting up the story in a way to completely counter some of these notions in Proverbs, which again is not a problem with Proverbs itself. It's a problem with how we often misuse Proverbs in our day-to-day life. Which then brings us to the key point of, or one of the key points of getting to the book of Job, I think, is to look at the relationship between the individual righteousness and rewards idea that we have. And we have to rediscover what this teaching is between these two things. Once again, the book of Job is protest wisdom because it's protesting against those who have hijacked and kind of distorted this teaching of Proverbs. And so the basic relationship between man and God is the one that is at question here. That is the center of Job's story. The struggle for Job is that he says, I'm an innocent person. I'm a righteous person. I've acted with integrity throughout my life. And this is what my life is about. This is what happens to me. It causes him to finally say in chapter 3, the beginning words where we're going to leave off here this morning. He's going to say, at last Job spoke. After sitting with his friends for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking, at last he opens his mouth and he curses the day of his birth. He's fed up. He's frustrated. His suffering is senseless, it's unwarranted, it's undeserving. And it's that struggle, that question at the heart of his belief system. And it's that question that we're left with as well, this suffering that we face that is often senseless. Job is not going to be this hero that we often paint him to be. He's not going to be the silent, humble, meek, submissive person that suffers in silence. He's going to protest. He's going to complain. He's going to lament. He's going to let out his frustration towards God. And it's going to be directed at God. And he's going to mount an argument against God, trying to hold God accountable for what's happening in his life. But this protest of Job is always going to be with the underlying desire to draw near to God. This is what his intention is. Though he protests, though he's frustrated, he's always doing it with the intention to get close to God. But we have to be careful with the conversations with the friends. Because the conversations that Job has with his friends, and these are going to be the topics of our next couple of weeks, we're going to find that there are so many instances in these conversations that kind of reflect and highlight some of the mainstream conversations that happen in Christianity today. These sort of ideas that kind of float around, that we can't question God, that we can't come to God with anger and frustration, that we can't possibly come to God asking to know his ways, that God is completely unknowable, and so we should just let it be and let that flow. We should not question the actions in our lives, that pain and suffering often leads us to a better place, or to pain and suffering serves a purpose, and it teaches us things about life. All of these conversations, all of these things that you often hear in Christian circles are the things that we're going to be putting into question for the next couple of weeks. Because some of these questions, some of these topics are going to be at the heart of the conversations between Job and his friends. At the heart of the book of Job you'll see what one Adventist theologian from Loma Linda describes as a man at the edge of reality. Job is pushed to the limits of his experience with life. He's pushed to the limits of what life can offer and what life is like. At the heart of our series for the next couple of weeks is going to be the questions about what is regarded legitimate expressions of faith. We're going to look at what might constitute an authentic form of faith through the lens of Job. What is what is regarded as a proper form of faith for Job, a proper expression of faith? Because once again, Job will make many laments, many complaints before God, trying to make sense of so many of these things. Job is not unlike, and it's not all that dissimilar to what we see throughout our country over this past week, where we see many people frustrated, pushed to the edges and limits of their reality because of senseless violence, pushed out into this space of uncertainty and distrust, which has now taken the form of protesting and rioting. But it's this question at the heart of human experience, this question about human reality. It's when we're pushed to our limits, when we're pushed to the edges of our reality, what is our response then to God? What role does God play in that space for us now? Are we going to valorize those who are submissive and meek, who just kind of huddle in the corner in fear without wanting to ask the hard questions that Job dares to ask? Or are we going to be like Job that believes, and despite all that he's going through, despite God's apparent absence, he wrestles, he struggles? And it's that wrestling and struggling, it's that making things personal, it's that making that experience personal for him that kind of leads him to a space of a better relationship with God. The book of Job poses many challenges for us today. But if you are one of those people who finds that mainstream Christianity doesn't speak to your problems, doesn't speak to your condition, if it doesn't speak to the space that you are in today, I invite you to take a look at the book of Job. Because Job, once again, is where all the nitty-gritty, the wrestling, where things just get kind of dirty and messy and muddy for Job. And the question that's going to lead us forward is, how will Job move forward from this place? I hope this series is a blessing for all of you. I hope that through our study of the book of Job, we find truer and more authentic expressions of our faith. May your questions, may your searching, may even your doubting find a place, a home to rest, to grow into the life of Christ. May this book provide you with a place to wrestle with God that you haven't found before. I pray that when we come out of this series, and when you come out of reading this book, that you find yourself in a better place, in a better relationship, with a better understanding of this reality that we face.